Hi everyone, my name is Darby, and this presentation is going to be on C.S. Lewis and the historical and social context that is happening around in most of his writing. Um, Most of C.S. Lewis's life, in the early years when he was really discovering intellectual and philosophical ideas, he had pronounced that he was an atheist. And that actually played a really big role later on into his life as well when we kind of talk about nihilism and the impact that it had on the Christian themes throughout the works of fantasy that he had. Um, During his authorship, he was going through a lot of historical change throughout England. In his early years of college, he actually was involved in World War I, and then later on, World War II was happening while he was writing The Great Divorce, The Chronicles of Narnia, and different things like that. So definitely the cultural and the social changes that were happening in England had an impact on how he was writing the importance of Christianity and the importance of purpose that people had through allegory in The Great Divorce, through the Screwtape Letters, and how that played a huge role in politics and how he looked at that as being a big factor in how people viewed themselves and the world around them. C.S. Lewis himself experienced a huge transition in his own life after studying at Oxford and meeting certain key people. Some literature that really influenced him heavily with his Christian ideas and later in his own writing were George MacDonald and even G.K. Chesterton. Both of them brought up ideas that he had not really considered before as far as Christianity and the idea of a good God, even in the midst of hard things like the war or him losing his mother and things like that. So there was big things that he hadn't really considered, which then plays a role into nihilism, which we'll look at next. So nihilism in its very nature suggests that everything is essentially meaningless or lacking purpose, and that things around us can never be fully understood. And this stems a lot from existential ideas. And while nihilism has been around for a long time, Nietzsche was the kind of philosopher behind a lot of that. It's really picked up ground even in the 19th, 20th century, right when Lewis was writing a lot of his works, and those were some things that kind of influenced his way of thinking when he was a pronounced atheist, and then also how he chose to write his pieces as he moved towards Christianity. Nihilism in itself is kind of suggesting this moral relativism that's suggesting that there's really no bounds, there's really no lines, and Lewis makes the assertion that there is indeed boundaries and there's indeed lines, and there's also things that are concrete, such as God and his purpose for us, and that we don't lack purpose, that we're nothing and we're not meaningless. While there is an air of mystery around a God who is greater than human beings, and there is much to be understood with that, there's also a guarantee that we get to spend eternity. And so there's this tension there. And there's several examples of how Lewis uses his own Christian ideas to kind of combat this idea of nihilism and these social changes that were changing around him at the time. Through a series of Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis uses allegory and fantasy to outline this grand plan that Aslan has created. Even before the Pevensey children even get to Narnia, there's grand purpose and design behind their arrival and their role within the world of Narnia. In The Great Divorce, which is what we just read, many of the ghosts themselves kind of talk about this existential idea of like their own existence. Why do they exist if there's nothing really past this gray, boring town, this translucent, boring place, and many of them feel hopeless, like there's no greater purpose beyond these empty and insubstantial places, and the narrator really begins to see that how there are concrete things and there's solid things in life that give pathways to purpose and meaning. You have to reach out and take hold of those, and that's where the difficulty comes. In Mere Christianity and the Screwtape Letters, Lewis explains that some of the greatest destructions for Christian thought is this idea of moral relativism or nihilism, where it's just this throwing out the idea that there could be anything with greater purpose or greater meaning. And so he kind of uses his fantasy literature to outline those ideas. And so the historical and social context and the wars that were going on during his writing and caused strife, and also caused Lewis himself, before he was even a Christian, to kind of look deeper into these ideas, into philosophy and religion. From there, he was able to see that ultimately the ideas that he'd been living by, mostly, atheism and the denying that there's higher purpose and higher meaning, proved to be wrong according to the worth in people, the design of the world, and the good God that ultimately governed it all. So all of these factors ultimately led and influenced Lewis in his desire to write things of meaning and purpose, and most of that was through fantasy literature and things of such nature.